My husband thought he took everything in the divorce. The house, the car, even the dog, who never liked him anyway but went along with it because dogs don't understand betrayal the way people do. He walked out of that courtroom with a smile stretched so wide I thought his face might crack, and he shook his lawyer's hand like they'd just won a Super Bowl. What he didn't know, what he never once thought to ask in 11 years of marriage, was who actually signed his paychecks. Not the name printed at the top, the actual hand that moved the pen every other Friday. That was me. And in 3 weeks, that hand was going to stop moving. My name is Rachel. I was 38 years old when my marriage ended, and I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because I think a lot of people believe revenge has to be loud. It doesn't. Sometimes it's just quiet math, done correctly, by someone everyone assumed was too tired to do it. I met Daniel when I was 26. He was charming in that specific way. Ambitious men are charming, where you can't tell if he's interested in you or interested in what you represent. I found out later it was mostly the second thing, but by then we'd been married 9 years and had built a life that looked, from the outside, enviable. A colonial house in a good school district, even though we didn't have kids yet. 2 cars in the driveway. A husband who worked his way up at a mid-sized logistics company called Halverson Freight, starting as an operations coordinator and climbing, year by year, toward regional director. What Daniel didn't advertise, what he barely acknowledged even to me, was that I was the one who kept us afloat during his climb. I have a background in accounting. Not glamorous work, but steady, precise work, the kind that doesn't get you invited to galas but does get you a very specific kind of knowledge about how money actually moves through a company. When Daniel's company needed a part-time controller to manage payroll and vendor accounts during a leadership transition, I took the contract. It paid well, it was flexible, and it let me watch, from a strange and intimate angle, exactly how my husband's employer operated. I processed the payroll for the entire regional office for 4 years. I signed off on every paycheck that went out, including my husband's. Including, eventually, his boss's expense reimbursements. Including things that, if I'm being honest, I noticed long before Daniel ever gave me a reason to look closely. The betrayal, when it came, didn't come as a single dramatic moment. It came the way most real betrayals do, in small increments I talked myself out of noticing. Daniel started working later. Then he started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. Then there were conferences that didn't line up with any conference I could find when I searched the company's own event calendar, which again, I had access to because of my job. I want to be clear that I didn't go looking for proof out of paranoia. I went looking because something in my stomach had gone cold and still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I found the messages in October. Her name was Priya. She worked in business development at Halverson, 2 floors up from Daniel. The messages weren't even particularly clever. Daniel had never needed to be clever before, because no one had ever checked. There were dinner reservations. There was a hotel receipt from a logistics conference in Phoenix that I happened to know, because I processed the expense report myself, was submitted as a solo business trip. I confronted him on a Tuesday night in November. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were trash night, and I stood there holding the printed messages while the bin was still sitting at the curb outside. And some small absurd part of my brain thought, I still have to bring that in later. Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't even really apologize. What he said almost word for word was, I make more money than you. This house is in my name. You should think carefully about what you want to do next. He said it calmly, like he was explaining a policy at work. He had already decided, somewhere in his head, how this was going to go. He assumed that because his salary was larger, because his name was on the deed, he held every card. He filed for divorce 3 weeks later. His lawyer was aggressive and expensive, a man named Gregory Fenn who specialized in exactly this kind of asset-heavy split. Daniel wanted the house. He wanted to keep the newer car. He wanted, and I actually heard him say this to his brother on the phone, a clean break where she doesn't end up owning half my future. He believed his future was untouchable because it lived inside Halverson Freight, a company where he was rising fast, and where, as far as he knew, I had no remaining connection at all. He was wrong about that, but I didn't correct him. Not yet. I want to explain something about how I operate, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I don't get loud when I'm hurt. I get quiet. My mother used to say I had a still water temper. that I could look calm on the surface for weeks while something underneath was working itself out completely. During the divorce proceedings, I was the picture of composure. I agreed to reasonable terms. I didn't fight for the house because frankly I didn't want to live in a house that had Priya's fingerprints on the memory of it. I let Daniel believe he had won because letting him believe that was strategically useful. What Daniel didn't know, and what his lawyer never thought to ask, was the exact nature of my contract role at Halverson Freight. During the divorce, I never once mentioned my job in detail during settlement conversations because it genuinely wasn't relevant to the division of marital assets. My income was modest and documented. Nothing about it triggered scrutiny. But my access hadn't changed. I still held the same login credentials, the same signing authority on the mid-level payroll and vendor accounts, right up until my contract's natural renewal date, which fell 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Here's the piece Daniel never understood about corporate structure, because he'd spent his whole career focused on climbing rather than watching the mechanics underneath him. Halverson Freight's regional office had grown fast, and in the scramble to keep up, certain financial controls hadn't caught up with the growth. Payroll compliance, vendor verification, expense report auditing above a certain threshold. These processes were supposed to be handled by a dedicated internal controls team, but that team had been perpetually understaffed, and a lot of that responsibility had quietly landed on the part-time controller, on me. I had spent 4 years noticing irregularities I wasn't required to report because they fell outside my specific scope. Small things. A vendor contract for warehouse security services that renewed automatically every year at a price nobody had renegotiated since it was signed. A price that happened to route a portion of its margin back through a shell entity connected to Daniel's boss's brother-in-law. I'm not a forensic accountant, and I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand what I was looking at when I first noticed it 3 years earlier. I just filed it away, the way you file away a smell that isn't quite right, without knowing yet what's rotting. After the divorce finalized, I did something I want to describe carefully, because I need people to understand it was not illegal, not vindictive in the eyes of the law, and not something I invented out of thin air. I compiled, in an organized and factual way, every irregularity I had legitimately observed during my time processing Halverson's regional payroll and vendor accounts. Expense reports that didn't match travel records I had access to as the person who processed reimbursements. A vendor contract that had never been competitively rebid despite company policy requiring it. Timesheet patterns for a certain regional director, my ex-husband, that didn't match the international shipping calls he claimed to be making during hours he was actually, according to hotel and restaurant charges, I had also processed, in Phoenix, with a woman from business development. I didn't leak it to a tabloid. I didn't post it online. I did what any responsible person with fiduciary knowledge is supposed to do. I submitted it, formally and in writing, to Halverson Freight's Internal Ethics and Compliance Office, along with a secondary copy to their external auditing firm, because internal compliance offices at mid-sized companies have a way of quietly losing uncomfortable documents when the person implicated is popular with leadership. The compliance investigation took 11 weeks. I know because I counted every one of them. Not with satisfaction exactly, more with the strange patience of someone who has finally set something in motion after years of watching it sit still. The reveal, when it came, wasn't something I orchestrated to be public. I didn't need to. Corporate investigations have their own gravity. Daniel's boss, the regional vice president whose relative benefited from that inflated vendor contract, was placed on administrative leave first, then, because Daniel's timesheets and expense reports had been flagged as part of the same review, and because the affair with Priya surfaced as a conflict of interest issue given her role in the same regional office, Daniel was called into a meeting with HR and legal on a Thursday morning in March. I wasn't there, obviously, but I heard about it later from a former colleague still working in the accounting department, someone who had no idea about my history with Daniel and was just relaying office gossip. She told me a regional director had gone white as paper during a compliance meeting, had started stammering about how he could explain the Phoenix trip, and had been escorted out of the building that same afternoon with a banker's box of desk items and a security escort who, she said, looked deeply uncomfortable the entire elevator ride down. Halvorsen terminated Daniel for cause, which under his own employment contract meant he forfeited his unvested stock options, the very financial cushion he'd been counting on to fund his new life with Priya and the newer, nicer condo he'd already put a deposit on. His severance evaporated. His reputation in a fairly small regional logistics industry did not survive the story either, because these industries are smaller than people think, and compliance terminations travel through professional networks the way weather fronts move through a valley, quietly and completely. The house he'd fought so hard to keep in the settlement became difficult to afford on unemployment. Priya, I heard, distanced herself within about 2 months, which I suppose tells you something about what kind of foundation that relationship was actually built on. I didn't do any of this by breaking a law or fabricating a single document. Everything I submitted was true, was something I had legitimately observed while performing the job duties I was contracted to do, and was something any compliance office would have wanted to know regardless of my personal history with the people involved. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't interested in revenge that required me to become someone I couldn't recognize in the mirror. I was interested in the truth finally landing where it belonged. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty. I don't, and I've thought about that honestly, because guilt is worth examining rather than dismissing. I didn't destroy Daniel's life. Daniel destroyed Daniel's life, across several years, through several decisions, each one made freely and with full information about what he stood to lose. All I did was stop absorbing the cost of protecting him from the consequences of those decisions. For 11 years I had been, in a very literal sense, the quiet infrastructure that kept his professional and financial life running smoothly. I signed the checks, I balanced the books, I caught the errors before they became disasters. When he decided I was disposable, he was also, without realizing it, deciding to run his own life without the person who'd been catching him. He told me once, in the last angry conversation we had before the divorce was final, that I should think carefully about what I wanted to do next, because he held every card. I have thought about that sentence many times since, usually with something closer to sadness than anger, because it revealed how little he understood about the game we were actually playing. He thought the cards were the house, the car, the title on the deed. He never thought to ask who was sitting behind him at the table the whole time, quietly keeping score. I live in a smaller place now, by choice, closer to the water, in a town where nobody knows the story unless I choose to tell it. I still work in accounting, though not for Halvorsen anymore, and not for anyone connected to Daniel's world. I've found there's a particular kind of peace in being underestimated. People assume the quiet person in the room is the least dangerous one. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes the quiet person is simply waiting for the numbers to finish adding themselves up. Some people play checkers, moving loudly, one aggressive square at a time, certain that speed and volume are the same thing as winning. I was always playing something slower. I was playing the long game, and I was very, very good at math.